The knock on the door echoed like a bad omen. No one in the compound expected visitors at that hour. It was past midnight, and the old building was unusually quiet, save for the relentless whir of mosquitoes. When Jack opened the door, what he saw made his stomach churn. A man, drenched in sweat and trembling, holding nothing but a small plastic bag and a look of desperation. Jack, a middle-aged taxi driver, had lived in the compound for nearly 2 decades. The building, a crumbling relic from the 1970s, housed various tenants, each with their quirks and secrets. It was a place where you kept to yourself and prayed the roof didn't collapse on your head during a storm. The landlord, a reclusive man who lived in another town, rarely showed up. Rent was cheap, and that was enough for everyone. The new tenant, who introduced himself as Tand, was different. His arrival at such an odd hour was just the beginning of what would be an unsettling series of events. Jack, known for his welcoming nature, offered him a spot in the small room next to his. The room had been vacant for months after the previous tenant, an old woman who sold akra by the roadside, had died suddenly. The landlord hadn't bothered to clear out her belongings, so the room still smelled faintly of burnt oil and decay. Tand was quiet. He didn't say much about himself, only that he had recently lost his job in Lagos and was looking for a fresh start. His clothes were worn, and his eyes were sunken, betraying a deep exhaustion that words couldn't capture. The neighbors whispered about him, about how he never left his room during the day, how he seemed to be afraid of something, or someone. But Jack brushed it off. Everyone had their struggles. The first sign that something was off came a week later. Jack returned from a long day of driving to find the compound in chaos. Neighbors were gathered outside Tan's room, shouting and banging on the door. Mrs. Okoro, an elderly woman known for her gossiping, was at the center of it all. "He's been in there for days," she cried. "I've been knocking, but no answer. And the smell, something's not right." Jack pushed through the crowd and knocked on the door. "Tand, it's me, Jack. Open up." There was no response. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of sweat, fear, and something else, something foul. Jack hesitated, then forced the door open. What he saw made him step back. Tand was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, eyes wide open but unseeing. He was clutching the plastic bag he had brought with him that first night. The room was in disarray, clothes scattered everywhere, the old woman's belongings tossed around as if a tornado had hit. But the most disturbing thing was the writing on the wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, "I'm sorry. Forgive me." After that night, Tan became a ghost in the compound. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. He avoided eye contact and flinched at the slightest sound. The other tenants began to avoid him, their initial curiosity turning into fear. Jack tried to reach out, but Tan shut him out completely. The situation grew worse when strange things started happening. Objects would go missing, small things like spoons, shoes, and once, even Mrs. Okoro's beloved cat. Doors would creak open on their own, and the sound of whispering voices filled the air late at night. The tenants were on edge, and fingers were quickly pointed at Tand. Jack defended him at first, but even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow Tand wherever he went. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Jack decided to confront Tand. He knocked on the door and waited, half expecting to be met with silence again. But this time, Tand answered. His appearance had deteriorated further, his skin was pale, and he had lost weight. The room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering candle on the floor. "Tand, what's going on? You need help?" Chaik said gently. Tan looked at him, and for the first time, there was a spark of something in his eyes, fear, guilt, or maybe both. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a loud crash came from the room next door. They both jumped, and Chaik rushed out to see what had happened. It was Mrs. Okoro's room. The door was wide open, and the old woman was on the floor, unconscious. The room was a mess, as if someone had ransacked it. Chaik's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. She was breathing, but barely. "Tand, call for help," Chaik shouted, but when he turned around, Tand was gone. Mrs. Okoro survived, but she was never the same. She moved out of the compound the following week, muttering about spirits and curses. The other tenants were terrified. Rumors spread like wildfire. Tand was cursed, they said. He had brought something evil with him. Chaik didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The strange occurrences continued, growing more frequent and more disturbing. One night, Chaik woke up to find his own room freezing cold, despite the stifling heat outside. He could hear whispering, but when he looked around, there was no one there. Desperate for answers, Chaik confronted Tand again. This time, Tand was in even worse shape. He hadn't eaten in days, and his hands were trembling. "Tand, please, tell me what's going on," Chaik pleaded. "I want to help you." Tand finally broke down. In a halting voice, he revealed the truth. Before coming to the compound, Tand had been involved in something terrible in Lagos, a botched robbery that had resulted in the death of an innocent man. Tand had managed to escape, but he had been haunted by guilt ever since. The plastic bag he carried contained the man's wallet, a constant reminder of his crime. He believed the man's spirit was following him, tormenting him, and that it had now latched onto the compound, spreading its malevolent influence. Chaik was horrified, but he knew they couldn't go on like this. He convinced Tand to go to the police and confess. It was the only way to make things right. Tand's confession brought some relief to the compound, but the damage had already been done. The strange occurrences stopped, but the tenants were never the same. Many moved out, unable to shake the fear that had gripped them for months. The building, once full of life, became a shadow of its former self. Chaik stayed, though. He couldn't leave the place he had called home for so long. But he kept to himself more, and his once friendly demeanor turned somber. He couldn't forget what had happened, couldn't forget the man who had brought so much darkness into their lives. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the broken windows, he could still hear the whispers. Years passed, and the compound continued to deteriorate. New tenants came and went, unaware of the building's dark history. Chaik grew older, his hair turning gray and his body slowing down. He had seen too much in his life, and the weight of it all was starting to take its toll. One day, a young couple moved into the compound. They were bright, optimistic, and full of hope for the future. Chaik watched them from his window, feeling a pang of sadness. They didn't know what they were getting into. As the days went by, Chaik noticed something strange. The couple's behavior started to change. They became withdrawn, their eyes dark and hollow. They avoided the other tenants and kept their curtains drawn at all times. It wasn't long before Chaik started hearing the whispers again. He knew then that the curse had never really left. It had just been waiting, biding its time, until someone new came along. Chaik wanted to warn them, to tell them to leave before it was too late. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The house had a way of holding on to its victims, of drawing them in and never letting them go. And so, Chaik watched in silence, knowing that the cycle would continue, that the darkness would never truly be gone. Because in that old, crumbling building, some things were meant to stay hidden. Some things were meant to stay cursed. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like and comment, click on link below.